Okay, I've got a document here with two different inks. Forgive the very basic design here, but it gets the point across well. So I want to use this very simple design first. I'm going to zoom in on just this area here, and we can see that there's two inks that are right next to each other. The page hits the printing press. The paper, which is flying through at high speed, maybe moves a fraction of a millimeter. Let's see what happens. I'm going to fake this by grabbing this cyan box, and I'm going to move it over, let's say, just half of a point. Wow! What happens to the colors? They misregister, and you get a sliver of white paper between the colors. That looks ugly. And the fix for this is called trapping. In trapping, someone adds a little bit of color down the middle just in case these colors misregister on press. Now, I want to get two things clear here right at the start. First, not every document needs to be trapped anymore. Printing has come a long way in the past few years, and some printers simply aren't even trapping, and they still get great results. It totally depends on the printer, the paper stock, the press they're using. So before you get all head up about trapping, check with your printer first. The second thing I need to point out is that humans should not need to trap documents. Your documents should be trapped by computer software downstream somewhere, like at the printer, without you ever even knowing about it. Unfortunately, life isn't always fair, and we humans are sometimes forced to know something about trapping ourselves. So, with that in mind, I will show you a couple of ways that you can do trapping in InDesign. First, the manual method, the brute force method. I'm going to undo this with Command-Z or Control-Z on Windows to go back to where I was. And I'm going to open the swatches panel, and I'm going to apply a color stroke to this cyan frame here. That actually gave me a 1-point frame, which is far more than I would usually use. Go to the stroke panel, you can see that this is 1-point stroke around this object. Usually for trapping, you'd use something much smaller, like a 1/4 point. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to make it much bigger, like a point. I'm also going to make sure that the align stroke is set to the first one, the center the stroke on the frame edge button. That way, half of the stroke will fall over to the left on top of the magenta frame, and half of it will fall on top of the cyan frame. That's typically best practice for doing stroking like this. We have a stroke around this frame, but we need to overprint it on top of the magenta. Otherwise, it'll simply knock out that magenta. That's not very useful. So I'll go to the window menu, I'll open attributes, and I'm going to overprint the stroke. Turn on overprint stroke, and we can see that there's a little bit of overlap now. The reason I can see that overlap is because I had overprint preview turned on in the view menu. If you don't have that turned on, you won't see your overprints. All right, let's zoom in here even more so we can see what's going on. Half of the cyan stroke, a half of a point, is overlapping on top of the magenta, and it's overprinting it so we get a kind of a purple right along that edge. Now, if something happens to misregister this, again, let's say the cyan gets pushed over to the side just a tiny bit. Let's say it gets pushed over a 1/4 point. What happens? Well, it's covered. It's overlapping enough, so no big deal. On the other hand, this is still pretty clunky because, look at this, the cyan is sticking out above the magenta now where it wasn't before, and it's messy. To get these really clean takes a lot of work. It's not always worth the hassle, but I at least wanted to point out that you can do this. I'm going to undo this with Command-Z or Control-Z several times to go back to where I was. Now both objects are right next to each other with there's no stroke on that cyan. I just want to get back to where I was. Nice clean version because I'm going to show you a second way of doing trapping in InDesign. A lot of people don't realize that InDesign has a whole trapping engine built into it, just like in high-end trapping software. And they don't know about it because it's kind of hidden. It's inside the print dialog box. So we're going to go to the file menu and choose print, and I'm going to choose the output pane here, and we can see that we have different options for our output. If you choose separations or in rip separations, you get the ability to do trapping. And the trapping that I'm talking about is application built in. That means use InDesign's own trapping engine. If I'm printing directly to a plate setter or to whatever printer I have, then I would choose a printer here, set this to separations, and then I could use application built in. On the other hand, it doesn't demo very well, so I'm going to show you a trick to actually get a PDF file where I can see my trapping in it. I do that by choosing the Adobe PDF driver up here, the printer itself. So I'm going to be printing to PDF. And that uses Acrobat's Distiller program to make our PDF. And I'm going to print not separations, but in rip separations. this gives me a composite CMYK PDF, but I can still have trapping built into it. So that's kind of cool. So I've got PDF, in-rip separations, application built in, and then, of course, I would set up the rest of the print dialog box the way I'd want to have it set up. You do have some control over this trapping if you look inside the Ink Manager. And I talked in the last movie about how Ink Manager shows up all over the place. Here's one more place that it shows up, inside the print dialog box. So I'll click on Ink Manager, and we can see that there's a bunch of stuff here, like cyan is a normal type ink with a density of 0.61, and it's sequence 1, and you know what? This is highly technical stuff that you really don't want to be messing around with. I wrote about it in my book, Real World InDesign, or you can find information about this in the help docs if you want, but I'm not going to get into this. It's just way too technical. In general, you don't need to mess around with any of this. So I'm going to click cancel. I just wanted to point out that it was there. Okay, let's go ahead and make our PDF and see the trap that InDesign's trapping engine created for us. So I'll click print, and it goes ahead and it writes PostScript to disk, and it feeds that PostScript into Distiller, and whatever the last used job settings were, whatever my default job settings in Distiller are, it runs through those job settings, and it leaves us with a PDF file that's out here on the desktop. So there we go. I'm just going to go ahead and double click on that to open it in Acrobat. And we see the same page with the same very basic 2-color design here. And let's zoom in so we can really see this. Even more. Get all the way in here. Let's say to 100%, and we can see the trap that it created. We've got 100% cyan on one side, 100% magenta on the other side. And look at that really sophisticated trap shape that it built right down the edge. That is a really good quality trap. But would I recommend doing this on a final printed piece? Well, no, not if there were any chance of a true in-rip trapping, or if the printer had any kind of trapping software that they could use instead. Most large printers do these days. But in a pinch, when you have to do the trapping yourself, you use what you have, and this is pretty good.